My name is Shirley Rodriguez. I'm Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy in London. And I was here yesterday. I think many of you were here yesterday too when Sadiq attended and gave a little, sort of did a fireside chat with Frank, and met Hugh here at the Royal College as well, just talking about air pollution in London and some of the work that we've been doing here, but also some of the international work and the challenges and opportunities we're facing. And I know that's the topic that you've been having over the last 2 days, really, of the challenges, opportunities, the research that you've been coming out with. And I just wanted to echo Sadiq's thanks to you all, to Frank and colleagues at ERG for all the work that you've been doing. I know under hard times, it's always difficult, you know, from funding, just the usual stuff about funding and just getting the day job done, but also some of the sort of more political attacks that some of you might be facing in the work that you're doing, and really value your support for that independent peer review, that we really value that research and that evidence that really helps us develop the policy that is making a difference in London. And we have the proof from Frank's team to show that, so brilliant. Today, we're going to have here just ask some questions of this really esteemed panel here. But we've asked, they've asked, in fact, if we can have short answers and questions, so we can open this up to the floor. So if you've got questions, do keep them in mind, and we'll open that up to the end. I'm not quite sure we've got mics as well, so we can do that. So let me just introduce the panel. So first of all, on my right is Rosamond Odu-Kisi-Debrah, who many of you know already, a passionate grassroots campaigner, founder of the Ella Roberta Family Foundation. Rosamond raises awareness about the health impacts of air pollution, particularly on asthma and related conditions. And you'll have seen, and many of you experienced, our unwavering commitment to promoting clean air as a human right, which is absolutely inspiring. And then on my left is Professor Camilla Kingdon, who has a background in neonatology and medical education, has made significant contributions to the field of paediatrics, is the president of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, so has a deep understanding of the challenges faced by young patients, and really has loads of valuable insights that we can bring into this area. And then we have, again on my left, Professor Francesco Forestier, who has extensive experience in public health and epidemiology, should have practiced that, conducted groundbreaking studies into the health effects of various environmental and occupational exposures, and advanced our understanding of air pollution and its impacts on human health. And then on my right, far right, is Professor Dan Greenbaum, as the President and CEO of the Health Effects Institute, has played a pivotal role in providing impartial and credible science on the health effects of air pollution. Huge expertise in air quality management and informing decision makers, so really been instrumental in shaping air quality policies around the world. And last but not least is Dr. Sarah Woolnough, as the CEO of Asthma and Lung UK, has been a really huge advocate for improving care and support for individuals with lung conditions. Her extensive background in policy and communications, huge passion for clean air and lung research. So it's absolutely invaluable in our work in London, and I know across the country, in fighting against respiratory diseases. So that's just a little introduction of who the panel is. So let's just get on with the panel discussion. So I've got a few questions. The first one is directed to the whole panel, really. And really, this is something that Sadiq talked about yesterday about, and was actually asked, I think, many times about air pollution. And is it a social justice issue? And do we have sufficient policies, or what do we need to do to really address those health inequalities caused by indoor and outdoor air quality? You know, how can they be addressed or prioritised? So maybe if I start at the end with Dan, and then just work our way along.
Sure. Well, first of all, yes, it is. So that's my answer. No, but importantly, I think as we've looked at this, it's very important to place air pollution in the context of all of the other stressors that people face, whether it's poor housing, whether it's poor medical care, or a number of other factors that come into this. I think the other piece that I would argue is that it's a lot easier to control new sources of pollution, and it's much harder to go at the old sources of pollution, the older housing, the older vehicles, which in many cases the poorest people have to use the oldest vehicles. And I was pleased to hear the mayor talk about yesterday efforts to subsidize things that can allow everybody to potentially get access to cleaner vehicles, cleaner things. But that's an ongoing challenge that particularly hits socially disadvantaged populations, which is the legacy of what's going to be left over that takes the time, the old diesel buses, the old diesel trucks, the other pieces, and getting those off the street are very important.
Thanks. Sarah?
Thank you. I'd say a couple of things. I mean, yes, absolutely. It's an issue of social justice, but at Asthma and Lung UK, we often talk about respiratory diseases being intimately tied up with social justice. You're 7 times more likely to die of a lung condition if you live in one of the poorest communities across the UK, and of course air pollution, poor air quality is one of the drivers. So for us in our work, we try to, I suppose, put that front and centre of how we talk about lung health and how we talk about the importance of tackling air quality. And to keep the answer brief, I think one of the things we're really trying to unpick is barriers to change, and we have published a report recently linked to a campaign around affordability of change. So lots of the people we talk to, lots of our beneficiaries, people living with lung conditions, are very passionate about clean air and want to make changes in their lives and see changes in their community. They often cite affordability as the major barrier stopping them in their daily lives, notwithstanding some of the other sort of macro issues they face, but as the thing that will stop them changing their car or using different modes of transport.
Can you just, before I move on, just pick a couple of the, from your report, some key conclusions on the how?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say is there's a huge appetite for change. So when we go out and talk to people living with lung conditions, the vast majority, and people that care about lung health, the vast majority are hugely supportive of clean air measures. And that's in large part because they see the impact of toxic air on their health. So about half of people living with a lung condition that we talk to, with asthma, bronchiectasis, COPD, and so on, will cite toxic air as a trigger for their lung condition, and therefore are very supportive of change. The major barrier, as I say, is often affordability for them, or that's what they perceive in their communities. So things like scrappage schemes, things like more investment in public transport are what they cite as something they'd like to see more of.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And Rosamond?
Where do I
Big
start?
question.
Where do I start with it? Actually, to the scientists, I just took a phone call from my younger daughter, and I was listening to your talk. Do you know what she said to me? Something for you to ponder on whilst this panel goes on. She said, "Oh, Mum, I think we need to see a cardiologist because I don't feel very well." And I think I will start off by saying, to start off with, we don't all breathe the same air. Some of us breathe better air than others. And this has been an ongoing battle between myself and even in other campaigners. I think what they don't understand is exposure and how some people are, the people who are more susceptible to air pollution, they don't have as long as other people. They think they can continue breathing filthy air for, I don't know, a couple of years, or I think policymakers as well, they don't understand. They think we can bring in this policy and just wait to see. And Sarah will tell you that's not how it works in real life. Also, there are some things which we actually know. We know poorer people live closer to main roads. We know, due to the systematic nature of the thing, and when I see this, people always get a little bit nervous. We know the top jobs, they are not done by black or brown people. So you really go where your money, where you can afford. And we also know that the cheaper houses are closer. We actually know this. And when I start talking about this, people sort of look a little bit awkward about it. But that is the reality. And what I'm not impressed by, I think the lack of diversity in this area of climate change or air pollution. The people who are most impacted, They're not part of the discussion. So we can all sit here and say, these are the solutions. We can decide what, based on reading brilliant reports and stuff, that these are what the solutions are. We don't ask, and we then go out and want to implement them. And I am really saddened that despite all the major efforts that Sadiq has made, and I've actually told him this, I don't know whether he will share it, that today, London appears to be one of the most congested cities in the world. And he has been pushing from day one since he came in. And there is a lack of understanding. And the behavior scientists actually explained why yesterday. People, for instance, people who are really anti-car, who are really cyclists, they have this ideological view that they believe that it is how they see the world, when in reality, when you go out, it is incredibly different. And what still saddens me is, COVID was good. The only positive thing about COVID was children who were severely asthmatic were not in hospital. And also, for the first time in this country, between March the 23rd and the 4th of July, nobody died in this country from asthma, by the way. It is the first time ever. Every year in London, between 8 and 12 children die. And the moment we reopened the economy, so that was on the 4th of July, and by the 14th of August, someone had already died. I think people do not appreciate that their policies. When I go into hospital, because I still go in with my children, more people there will look like me than they will look like majority of the audience. And people don't actually get to experience it. And I think it's brilliant sitting in here discussing all these things. But the phone call I got, I take it tomorrow morning, we're going to be back in hospital, and everyone will look just like us. I think if some people were more in this space, they could tell people what is really going on. And I think Ella would want me to say to people, it's not over climate anxiety that she was fearful of. She was fearful of dying. So I think if you've got asthma, then you know exactly what I mean. If imagine having something as huge as an elephant standing on your chest and you're suffocating. So ultimately what killed her was her own mucus. So Ella drowned in her own mucus. And when you say that, people sort of look a bit awkward. But she had extreme form of asthma. But asthmatics generally, that is what they are generally scared of. But I just don't hear them in these conversations. And that is, I've been in this movement now 9 years, and the makeup of it has not changed. And that for me is very, very concerning.
Thank you, Rosamond. I think there's a very visceral words and thoughts, because I think, it is incumbent on all of us, and we're not pointing to you necessarily.
No.
It's about all of us as policymakers, about how do we make sure that we are understanding the differences and the inequalities and actually addressing this in our policies and developments. And that really, your help with that in terms of your research and understanding this affects people differentially, and partly because of its happenstance, they happen to live by major polluted roads or by landfill sites or whatever, but we need to understand that and have the evidence in order for us as policymakers to really address that. So thank you for really highlighting that. I think maybe to you, Camilla, and whether you can pick that up, because I'm sure you're seeing some of this.
Rosamond is always a very hard act to follow, but I can only agree with her, and certainly in our clinical practice. And I've got colleagues around the country, for instance, who run, so I've got a really dynamic colleague up in the northwest in Liverpool who runs a clean air clinic, and he can predict the nature of the child's lung disease before he claps eyes on them based on their postcode. And that's because he knows where the heavy traffic roads are, where the housing quality is particularly poor, where their families living next to landfill sites. So there is a very, very close and reliable correlation between where you live and the nature of your disease in the case of asthma, or for instance, preterm babies with chronic lung disease. So, I couldn't agree with Rosamond more. And we know that children in this country, there are over 1 million children in this country with asthma. It is an extremely common reason for an emergency admission to hospital. We have the highest mortality from asthma in Europe. And there is a strong relationship with ethnicity and social deprivation. So, I mean, sadly, I can only agree with what everyone else has said. Just one final point is, as a pediatrician, I am very motivated by children's rights, because I think this is a rights issue. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child has more signatories than any other document of its kind. And we've all signed up to it. And the right to health, the right to play, these are fundamental rights that in this country we are not able to universally offer our children because of the issues that we're talking about today. So I think the rights-based approach adds an extra sort of depth to the way we need to tackle this.
Thank you. Francesco?
Yeah, just finally, of course, I agree what has been said. What I want to say is that the social justice issue is not the same everywhere. It's different, it's location specific. And we need to know more in each specific location what specific act or what specific exposure is producing social injustice. So it might be different in a large city, it might be different from the industrial area or from a rural area. I have a specific example there. In the 90s in Rome, we proposed the low emission zone for the closed center of the city. And this went under discussion, and then it was approved. And then after the evaluation of a few years, we realized that people living in that specific area were the richest in the city. And the traffic, instead of being in the center of Rome, was intensified in the surrounding. And the surrounding poor people were living. So that specific act of having low emission zone produce social inequality. So my proposal is that any intervention, since then I think, any intervention would need, let's say, like the ethical committee, the social justice review. Because if you don't do the review, what we are doing with this act, with this intervention, then you fail. You don't consider that, and you produce inequality. So that's specific request, I think. And in the UK, you have this fantastic champion of social justice for the health sector, Michael Marmot. I think the recommendation from Mike Marmot are excellent.
Yeah, okay. Thank you all very much for those. And then just moving to a little bit more of a specific question, I guess, and maybe staying with you, Francesco. One of the things that we've been doing in London is very much looking at the sort of intersection between air quality and climate change and the sort of policy responses. And do you see that as a good thing, or as a distraction, or something else? So over to you.
Yeah, you had the fortune in the past to have Martin Williams with you. And I recall he was always speaking about the silos. We have the silo of the climate change, the silo of the air pollution, and these silos never mix. And we need to have the discourse about the climate change together with the air pollution. And reducing air pollution is one of the most important acts to also prevent the climate change. So we need to put together these two aspects and reinforce the air pollution part. This has been neglected for a while. People living, I recall in WHO there was the climate change office and the air pollution office, and they didn't speak each other. And this is, a pain in a way.
Yeah. And maybe Dan, from your international experience?
Sure. Well, obviously, two major challenges that need to be thought about in an integrated fashion. I think some of that is fairly straightforward in the sense that they often come from the same sources. Some of that is not so simple. And when you think about how we've made progress on air pollution, you can put a catalytic converter on a car, but unless you change the entire way we travel, the entire way we move around a city, which you are trying to do, you can't deal with the underlying use of energy and the underlying greenhouse gases that come from that. And so it's really critical to sort of think about both of those things. I also think, and just to circle back a little bit to the first question, I do think there's an important lesson to be thought about and learned for the research community, whether it's the Environmental Research Group, whether it's my institution, in going to something that Rosamond said, which is we usually figure out what research we're going to do to solve a problem by sitting around amongst ourselves and thinking about what the issues are. We do talk to policymakers, but we fairly rarely sit down with community organizations and with community partners and create partnerships. Wellhome is a good example, the new program, the relatively new program that ERG is doing. We're trying to do the same thing, a different way of asking what questions should we be asking, what data should we be collecting, and to learn from the community what their perspective is. And I think that's important. That will be equally important in the climate change arena because many of the options that are out there, electric vehicles, those are not available to people, many of whom don't even own a car. Public transit, if it can be improved and invested in, can make a huge difference and can improve accessibility and mobility for all people.
Thank you. Actually, Sarah, I saw you nodding there, and I just wondered in the sort of conversations you have with the sort of community groups and individuals that you deal with, does climate change ever come up, or is it really, do they understand that there is a sort of a linkage, or?
Yeah, I mean, it comes up an awful lot. And I was thinking as I was listening, I suppose, of sort of both ends of the spectrum. So we've been doing a lot of work in schools. We've got a Clean Air Champions program. I mean, some others in the room run similar-ish programs. That actually is well, makes me feel very hopeful. So we go into schools with the partnership and help of some people in this room. We're doing quite a bit of monitoring with about 150 schools in London at the moment. We talk a bit about asthma, give a bit of asthma education, because every child will know someone with asthma in their class or in their family. And then we talk about tackling air pollution. And quite often the children are very well informed, actually, and make the link between climate and air pollution. But something else the charity does is we run about 150 Breathe Easy support groups around the UK, typically for people with longer-term lung conditions, COPD, bronchiectasis, and we will do things like singing for lung health, harmonica playing, breath work that really helps people to cope and live well with their lung condition. And I was with a group of volunteers who run these groups this morning and talking about some of the meetings I've been to. There was one very memorable one in Kings Lynn in Norfolk last summer during the heat wave, and I had this fantastic conversation with a very different demographic of members of this group, desperately worried about climate change linked to air pollution and air quality, and very passionate about it. I think there's a general point that if we're trying to build movements for change, actually it is helpful where it makes sense and where the evidence supports it to bring fields together. And I'm reminded, in a previous life I did quite a bit of work on alcohol policy, and in trying to deal with government, it was so often thought of as an antisocial behaviour issue under the auspices of the Home Office in the UK rather than a health issue. And so it can be very helpful where the evidence supports it to bring the two together.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And I'm just reminded of that sort of silo issue that Francesca talked about. I mean, certainly in London, what we get very much criticised at the moment is, that we were forced to go down the diesel route because it was all about carbon. And then obviously the research that we see increasingly every day about the harmful effects has caused us to pivot away from those sort of fossil fuel powered vehicles, which has caused people a lot of problems about, so why weren't you thinking about this at the time? So partly it's because the evidence wasn't necessarily as well known, or we weren't listening, but now we do. And I think that it's true both of, whether it's true of research institutions, it's also true of governments. I know that certainly I've seen the select committee that was inquiring into air pollution, where we had DEFRA and Department of Health and the planning department all sitting there saying it's not our problem, it's they're the lead, nobody would actually own the problem, which is why we have an issue with tackling air pollution and doing things that, you know, like Ella's law, taking that forward, because nobody would take responsibility for that. And maybe moving a bit further on to even further challenges that, you know, that are already out there and that we know about, but and I think you've heard about a little bit more today. But just a question here about water pollution and microplastics, because we're getting even more research now about the harm these do and the interlinkages with health. So I think to Camilla, I think just a sort of first question about, and this is both to you and Camilla and Francesco, really about what sort of action should we be thinking about, maybe drawing from the work that you've been doing on air pollution, really about how do we prioritise action on this as we start to see the emerging evidence of the harms it does?
So I'll let Francesco talk about the, I guess, the toxicology around microplastics. But I think kind of the broad principles, particularly for children, and actually we shouldn't just talk about children, it's really important to talk about women, mothers and pregnancy, because I mean, obviously there's a continuum. And actually the impact, certainly in the air pollution space, of what air pollution is doing to pregnancy is deeply concerning. And you can extrapolate really to any one of these environmental hazards, or in fact any aspect of climate change. So pregnant women and young children are particularly vulnerable. And in the case of young children, you know, it's a dose-response relationship. You know, in the same way, you don't need that much air pollution. Children are breathing faster, and therefore, you know, the same amount of air pollution that you and I might be exposed to will have a greater effect. It's the same with exposure via water. Children have developing organ systems, so damage could be potentially permanent. They have immature immune systems, so are less well equipped to deal with damage, damage via the immune system. So I think this is why we make a very special case around pregnancy and children, almost whatever we're talking about, because they are particularly vulnerable. And I think, you know, the more evidence that emerges for the impact on the growing child, the more alarmed I get, if I'm honest. And, you know, if we, just go back to the air pollution scenario, I think, you know, we often think air pollution respiratory for obvious reasons, but actually it's really concerning in terms of the wider impact on neurodevelopment. So some very elegant work that Frank's team contributed to, along with a group at King's College London, looking at normal term babies and MRI scanning and linking the shape and size of brain to exposure to air pollution during pregnancy, and showing a link to a change in shape and size of brain. And the same will occur with neural connections. Likewise, there's similar impact on the cardiovascular system. So we're dealing with an exquisitely vulnerable stage of life. So it doesn't matter what toxin you're talking about. Its impact is enhanced. But I'll let you talk more eloquently about microplastics.
Now, before going to microplastic, I want to underline what you said about the priority in addressing pregnancy outcome and small children, not only for the respiratory tract, but for all other conditions, including the cognitive aspect. You know, remember that the cognitive aspect is very important also for economical development. You know, the society cognitive average is a predictor of economic development. So it's a key aspect of the issue of the air pollution. Going to the new area, you know, I learned a lot today with the microplastic and what we have from water research. I think there are two different aspects. You know, for microplastic, in a way, what Stephanie was presenting today is a sort of mini research program that we need to expand. In a way, we need to have a long-term research program on microplastic at the beginning dedicated to understand what's the fate of this microplastic and what are the organs that are most susceptible to this effect. And this could be done in the toxicological environment, of course. And then the next stage is to design the proper EPI studies to address the issue. So it's a very long process, but we need to do this because the emergency of the issue. The problem of the water contamination is a little bit different because it's a sort of summary of all the possible chemical contamination that we have. The water, the drinking water is a sort of summary of what we have, and this summary is plenty of different chemicals from different reasons. Illicit drug use, licit drug use, and pesticides, and so different sources and different contexts. And in this waterborne epidemiology, we now have a sort of methods to detect these chemicals, but it's still premature to say what's the future for these methods. I don't want to be too rude, but it was clear for COVID-19. For COVID-19, the system was very useful. And at least in my country, I know in other countries in Europe, one could have been more useful was stopped. So when the COVID surveillance was in crisis because no one was reporting because of the self-test, then the waterborne epidemiology would have been very useful to see the variation in the incidence. But it was stopped. But so I really understand for infectious diseases. But for all the other contaminants, I see that as a sort of descriptive epidemiology. But we have to learn how to move from this descriptive epidemiology to something more. And this is still under discussion, I think.
So food for thought, I think, yes? It's a hugely interesting area for us because we get a lot of questions to the Mayor about what are you doing about plastics pollution, and we will get more about the microplastics and the ultra-processed foods and all of those things. And I think it is this issue about how are we preventative, how are we precautionary, I guess the word is, but in the absence of evidence, and not jumping too soon, a bit like the diesel discussion we had, so that we give people enough information as soon as we are able to. And I guess we're relying on people like you really to help us with that problem. Moving on to, we've had quite a conversation about the sort of issues and so on, but one of the things is, in understanding the exposure, we've talked about sort of how can we take action, whether it's an individual level or local authority level. So I'm sort of open this out to each of you. You can respond as individuals or other institutions. But how do you empower people to actually respond to the data, the evidence, to actually deal with those health implications? And we've had lots of information, the inquest into Ella Adu Kissy-Deborah's death, the coroner's, the Prevention of Future Deaths report was asking health institutions, health colleges to actually do more about informing medical professionals. I'm not sure that's been really taken up by the Department of Health yet. We're still following up with them on that. But the sorts of questions here. So maybe, Rosamond, I'll turn to you first. As whether it's individuals or local authorities or government, how do we empower people, or what do we say to people to do more of?
Well, I think it's really. I don't think Claire's here because Claire was part of the people who were giving evidence, and she's now gone home. But we were just sort of checking in with each other. I think individuals, by the way, can't do as much as people think. It's really up to the beginnings. The coroner was very clear. He was clear on when it comes to individuals, so raising awareness. There is a lack of understanding. So if you ask most people now about air pollution, they will know air pollution is not great, it's bad for them, but they don't actually understand the impact on their health, sort of, all the individual organs. And I think individuals can do very little. Number one, you need money, I've got to be honest. So for the inquest to happen, it did cost an awful lot of money, and individuals don't have. Someone who is impacted by this, they can hardly say, oh, I'm going to take the government to court. That is just not going to happen. I think the bit that I'm really disappointed in is all the evidence that the government has, and I still haven't managed to persuade them to do a public health campaign, even with, say, Chris Whitty's report. I have failed, by the way. I have completely, and I always put, people think I actually win all the time. I absolutely don't. I have completely failed to make the case economically why it's a good idea. I've failed to make the case for the National Health Service why I have. And I think if people were in the room when I'm having these meetings, they'll be surprised. I think to expect the individual to take on this task is quite a lot. It is almost impossible. You need governments to lead. That's what you need to do. The mayor has, I am incredibly grateful to him actually, because in a way he's kind of put like his mayorship on the line really for doing this, because we know previous mayors haven't been so brave to do what he's done. And my whole thing about the ultra-low emission zone was you can't really have it just in inner London, because then it makes it sound as if air pollution, it has borders. It should be rolled out across everywhere. And this is what has caused all the controversies that you might have actually seen. But I still stick by that. I still think it's what the inquest came up in the inquest, that this should be London-wide. And I think there's a lack of understanding of, I think one of the things I asked Frank when I speak to him is, can you help me package up the 4,000 deaths? Because I think people are, I think Ian and I just spoke about this just now, people are literally expecting 4,000 coffins to be lying there. And because they can't see, no, seriously. And I get people who do Freedom of Information Act, just to show you the lack of understanding. They do a Freedom of Information and they send it to me. And they say to me, Rosamond, air pollution is not a problem because there's only been one death. Hopefully you can get the irony in that whole situation. And that basically shows to me the lack of understanding. But unless you have leaders who are willing to lead on this matter, we're going to be... I think the individual can do very little. Look, Ella's asthma was so severe. It was one of the worst ever recorded in this country. And when we took samples from her body, it was kind of game, set, and match from that point of view. So it makes it easier. But my constant thing with the government, they keep on saying to me, the people are not yet where you are. And as a teacher, I always say that we need to educate the public. No, I haven't got, as you can see, there is no public health campaign. Also, PM 2.5, which the coroner was very, very clear about. The coroner actually said WHO guidelines should be a minimum requirement, not a maximum, because at WHO, we don't have any safe levels. Now, I can, as an academic, I can absorb all this in, but when you go out and talk to people, this means nothing to the general public. And I continue to say, I mean, I think people from the medical world have come on board. I have to give them their credit where it's due. And Stephen Holgate have done an enormous work to bring all the colleges on. And, you know, in future, doctors are going to be trained in this whole area. And they are going to be doing the bit. So gone are the days when I know Stephen was frustrated forever because they weren't listening to him. I think now it is a whole different ball game now. But unless the government, by the way, they do not see this as a vote winner. And if they're watching this, they'll think, oh God, there she goes. They don't. If they saw this as a vote winner, they would do something about it. And I'm very concerned at the lack of education, because the Public Select Committee last year again reviewed this and again repeated more or less what the coroner said. So yes, there are more articles in the papers now, there are more things, but I still think, you know, especially with the cost of living crisis, people they are worried about food on the table and things like this, they're not going to be worrying about the air that they actually breathe. And by the way, it's not, people go, why are you always having a go at the UK government? That's because I'm British and because I actually live here. But all governments are the same. And whichever country I go to, I just change my language and tackle all government. It's not just the UK government. And I think we had a major opportunity at COP26 to do phase out, and they went for phase down. And I think ultimately, people say, who is your enemy? Well, it would definitely have to be the fossil fuel companies, because it's all about money. And God, I hope I haven't offended anyone here, because it is really all about money. I think human health is not a priority. That's how, that is my conclusion. Because my challenge to Dr. Tedros is, how long are you going to continue to say 7 to 9 million deaths? People have heard that again and again and again. What are you actually going to do about it? So I'm glad they said we now have a health day, apparently, at COP28. So things are moving, hopefully, in the right direction. But I think to ask the individual to take on this is quite a lot. Everything seems to boil down to the individual. And I think people are just trying to survive, and then to tell them to take on this huge thing is, I think it's really, really unfair.
Dan or Sarah?
Oh, I'm sorry, go
Sarah,
ahead.
yeah, maybe
Well,
you
can,
could
can
pick
I
up, yeah.
briefly build on that? Because, I mean, I completely agree the burden can't be on the individual. I mean, it can't be. However, there's such a desire for information. You would imagine we would get asked this as the sort of National Lung Charity, what can people do? So absolutely, the start point is the burden shouldn't be on the individual. Clearly, we need broader action. But there's a real thirst for knowledge of what steps can I take in my daily life, particularly perhaps if I have an underlying health condition, to better look after myself. And so I partly want to make that point because I think this is where collaboration between the academic community, NGOs, policymakers is so critical. I mean, we do say to people, well, you know, clearly we need bolder government action. We need systemic change. However, you know, on a high air pollution day, don't go out and exercise in the middle of the day, do it in the morning, walk your children a back road to school if you can do. We try to give little micro practical bits of advice, all the while setting the more sort of systemic picture. I think the second point I'd make is information is power. So, I mean, my time involved in this field and these sorts of campaigns, you know, we published a big report called The Invisible Threat. You know, people can't see air pollution and it's a problem. If they could see it, we all know it would be easier to communicate about and easier to drive policy change. But if you equip them with really good information and good data, it helps. It doesn't solve the problem because we've still got difficult governments to deal with at times, but it really does mobilize people at local level. And we're seeing that in schools, we're seeing it with local community groups. So again, I mean, the importance of collaboration between researchers and campaigning groups in order that we can equip people with better information, personalised monitoring, easier to understand information about what air pollution means to them and in their community, I think is incredibly powerful. I mean, Rosamond is such a force of nature that she certainly is not failing at anything. No. But I think since the coroner's inquest, we are making small positive steps in health, and it's not as quick as any of us would like. But I do think some of the other, you know, the fact that we're having a much broader conversation about the health impacts, it's not just about the lungs, it's about a whole range of sort of clinical indications is helpful. And as one example of what we're trying to do, we have loads of incredibly motivated healthcare professionals who want to campaign with us. And so we're setting up campaign groups of healthcare professionals to mobilise for change, to help educate. There's a good example, my final point, in Manchester, of getting a group of healthcare professionals to go and advocate advocate to the mayor to say, come on, look at what's happening in London. This is what bold leadership on this issue looks like. We're here to communicate the evidence to you and to tell you to take bolder action. So if I'm trying to sort of shift Ian's reasons to be slightly cheerful, I think you know, we're making progress. It's a slow slog. But I would just emphasise to all of you in this room, please keep the research, information, ways that we can help empower people, both individually but also in their community to help them drive change, I think is critical, and they are thirsty for it.
Dan?
Well, you said most of what I was going to say. I will just highlight that. First of all, I've seen around the world that information gotten out broadly to people can make a huge difference. It made a difference under an authoritarian regime in China, who actually, once the citizens were tweeting on their own version of Twitter about their own data, not that the individuals made the change, but the government got scared and they did something about it. But I did want to highlight the Breathe program here, because I think that's something that ERG has done, that the mayor has embraced and really led on. And I think that's the kind of thing that can actually, over time, empower people, not the individual, I totally agree with that, but empower community organizations, empower members of parliamentary groups, et cetera, who want to do something, to say, I have the data here, and I know that this is a problem. And it's particularly important because we've actually done a pretty good job of getting rid of the visible pollution. I mean, we don't see the really bad days. I did get a WhatsApp from my daughter in the United States because of the forest fires are actually, in Canada, are actually coating the entire northeastern United States. We get those occasionally. Scotland just had a series, but we don't see it anywhere, and it's much harder unless there's a constant drumbeat of what the data is. This is a bad air pollution day, and that it's communicated.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to come in?
Just the data. I know people kind of go a bit glassy-eyed when you start talking about data, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of collecting data. And there are pediatricians, colleagues of mine, who are starting to link air quality data through the electronic patient record that now many parts of the NHS are invested in. And starting to track admissions and linking it to air quality data, and starting to really start interrogating, trying to understand that better. So I think we shouldn't. I think I know these are all sort of small things, but they will all start aligning. And it all starts with us making the case, listening to our patients' stories, using those, because once you have a kind of a human person attached to the stories, it's not just forgive me, but it's not a sort of dry piece of research, but actually you're talking about a human being and you're talking about a family. Actually, that starts, people, start sitting up in their seats and think, do you know what, I want to be part of this. I want to be much more specific when I see that child in A&E and try to understand, why do I keep seeing the same child coming into A&E, asking more questions about all the issues that we've been talking about. Then you start linking your air quality data through your electronic patient record. This is where change happens. So I sense why Rosamund is frustrated. But I do think, honestly, I have seen a seismic change in my profession only in the last 2 or 3 years. And actually, that's not that. I'm impressed by people like you making the case and kind of shaming us into doing something about it.
I think the reason why I'm frustrated, so why am I frustrated and why do everyone roll their eyes? The reason why I'm frustrated because in the beloved city we are, since Ella died, the number of 8 to 12 deaths of children from asthma has not changed. That is why. Yeah. So, and also I work with, so a lot of my work is not public facing. I work with respiratory teams. And as long as children continue to die, we're in 2023, and the 8 to 12 hasn't gone down, hasn't changed. The pandemic helped them a bit, and then we're now back to where we are. We have doctors with lots of knowledge. We have better medicine than when Els was alive. Better medicine. But think about that every single year, between 8 and 12 children, just in London alone, die from asthma. And for me, it is never, ever going to be acceptable. And as long as people ring me up and say, oh God, not another one, my frustration is going to continue. So that's why no one's done anything, but it's just the fact that children continue to avoidable deaths, because every inquest that comes out that I get to read it, it's like the same old story.
So we definitely aren't happy with where we are, I think, collectively. We know a lot has happened because of Rosalima's work, but also all of your work, which has been groundbreaking and ground shifting. But we know, as with climate change, the pace and scale of change we need is phenomenal, and we're just not there. But very hopeful with people like you in the room that we are getting there. Maybe Francesco, and then I'm going to open it up.
Just to add a little piece of my thought regarding this. You know, we have done a lot of very important steps. You know, you have listened, Zorana, this morning on what the activity, the advocacy activities with the medical societies. But still, I think that the role of health professionals, and especially physicians, is still very minimal. And potentially, it could be large. You know, we were speaking yesterday about the behavioral change. You know, the most important driver of behavioral change is the doctor. And the doctor could make prescriptions irrespective of the motivation. You know, just think about the co-benefits, you know, the prescription of, you know, walking and less meat consumptions and so on. So we need to have more education and more involvement of the doctors. And I have to say, at least in my country, there is no health and environment in the medical education, not at all. And the effort for primary prevention is zero. So we have to make, you know, the simple step to bring primary prevention as a first stage in the education of the doctors, including environmental health. And this is not, we have to outspoke. You know, this is so important because of the role of the physician, I think.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for two questions. We got, I know, Simon at the top there, if you're able to. Just right at the back, I'm afraid. Just say who you are, Simon.
Simon Burkett, Clean Air in London. Just want to say thank you for a great couple of days. 2 points. One is I don't think the sort of attacks on science, I think they'd like to be maintained, whether it's this year, mayoral elections, general elections, and just with general change on climate change. So I think we have decades of the same sort of discussions ahead. What I was just going to mention is that in the last hour, the government has issued a 30-degree heat alert for Friday, Saturday and Sunday.
Have they now?
And I predict that there will be some rain with it at times, but I predict that that will lead to high ozone. So can the people in this room, given what we've all heard, and including on the panel, do our best to make sure that people are properly warned. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Has anybody else got a question? Just down here in the third row. Just pass the mic along. Thank you.
I want to say to Professor Greenbaum, if he wants to look at pollution, visible pollution, just go to your nearest port.
Yes.
And it's not very difficult.
Or the vaporettos.
Well, yeah, we've got a particularly intense form of it. And so I'd like to say to the room, please help us work with the shipping industry that's far, far, far behind any other sector.
I might add the old diesels that go by the neighborhoods that are also very capable of putting out huge amounts of smoke.
Yeah, just to flag on the shipping, I know that the C40 have been doing some work with a green shipping corridor between, I think, don't know whether it's Shanghai or one of the Chinese port cities and Los Angeles, as but part of the start of trying to move them away from fossil fuels. But there's a lot more work to be done, and we know that shipping, like aviation, has been a huge laggard, if not a blocker, in this area. Any more? Quite, yes, sorry. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks for excellent discussion. Just to bring another barrier and a silo that we talked recently in Denmark, what is the reason we don't have public health campaigns about air pollution, is the silo between environment and health. In Denmark, is environmental ministry deals with air pollution, so they're not making public health campaigns. And we just had a provocative discussion a few weeks ago suggesting that maybe we should just move all the money from environment to health ministry to deal with air pollution, because in Denmark it's third cause of death after physical inactivity and smoking, for which we have campaigns, strategies, information. So that was, something to bring up also, moving this as a health risk factor, communicating, making strategies, and also bridging the silo between what's environmental problem, what's health problem, and lack of communications, along with climate change and air pollution silo.
Okay.
Can I just answer that? If you can get hold of the future death reports, I think what the coroner suggested can be applied the world over, i.e. the Department of Health needs to work with the Department of Transport, needs to work with the Treasury, needs to work with the Department of Environment. It's not an either or. I know because it was in the UK, people think it's directly towards. And regarding people in health, that education should be worldwide. It's not specifically to the UK. And Dr. Neera, that is her long-term aim, that everyone in health, medicine, science, everyone is working together. So I don't want people to look at the coroner's report and think it's just a UK thing. So you can go back and, otherwise I think, what was the whole aim of fighting for so long? It is literally for everyone, because I always say to, when people write to me from India, don't we count the children there? Yes, they absolutely do count. It's about children everywhere. I don't see a life in the UK as more important than a life in Ghana or India or whatever. All children are children, and they all deserve to breathe clean air, no matter where they live, no matter what race, no matter what socio-economic background.
Thank you, Rosamond. And I think on that note, we'll draw the panel to a close, and just to thank you all for participating. And I think maybe a round of applause to Dan, Sarah, Rosamond, Camilla, and Francesco.